This is Paul Carrigan here with Arlene Wilner, who is the author of many things, including an essay I read many years ago about teaching students who are resistant and more to reading certain texts, and more recently, just out, Rethinking Reading in College, an across the curriculum approach. Arlene has agreed to sit down with me today to talk about this book, and thank you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thanks for writing this. The writing across the curriculum movement has gained a lot of steam. It's institutionalized at a lot of places, but the idea of also teaching other kind of important, deep, fundamental intellectual skills, and I think in here you cite intellectual virtues across the curriculum, is still more nascent. So I just really appreciate just this solid contribution and encouragement and reminder that, like, everywhere that we're teaching students, we need to teach students how to learn, how to engage in all the ways, including reading. So in one of the appendices, you're discussing the complexity of the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, and you talk about how that complexity readers can choose to sidestep it and kind of walk away with a tidy understanding of the story if they want. You use a phrase that you say you don't want students to merely connect and respond to what they read. And in that case, instead of engaging with the complexity. But I'm thinking a lot of teachers would just love for their students to connect and respond to texts. So why is that mere? I guess, to put another way, why are you saying we need a grander vision for how our students, what students can do with text than connect or respond?
Thanks for that question, Paul. Yeah, obviously I'm not opposed to connecting and responding. But I do think our mission as teachers, as professors, is to help students go deeper. And especially when you're dealing with complex texts, which is typically what we teach, you do want them to see the layers, and you want them to see how the authors have embedded levels that you may access if you choose to go beneath your immediate responses. And so really a large part of my thesis in this book is that our immediate responses and our habits of reading and our immediate responses to texts do need to be interrogated, to use that oft-used word. And it's the job of the professor to help students see what perhaps they didn't see at first, or to at least entertain the possibilities that those other meanings are there and are meant to be aspects of the text that are considered.
I like how you put that. Our immediate responses need to be interrogated, and so we could even make that a habit, right? The habit be respond how we're going to respond, and then step back and say, okay, why did I respond that way? And teach our students to do that.
Yeah, I think it's Gerald Graff who wrote about the what he called the closest cliche syndrome. I think I mentioned this in the book, where you know, the path of least resistance for all of us, I guess, is to sort of translate an idea that we see in a text to something that's comfortable and familiar to us. I think it's just human nature, perhaps, to do that, unless we have cultivated, you know, the habit of, you know, self-questioning and the kinds of critical reading and meta-reading that that I talk about in the book, and I think more people are talking about these days.
I like that. Throughout the book, you return again and again to a concept that the concept of rhetorical reading, which early on you define as on page 12 here, quoting Haas and Flower. Not that you read a text, so it's not just trying to get the information out of it, but you're recognizing that it is a text created by someone in a particular situation for particular purposes. And so my impulse would have been to see that way of reading, rhetorical reading, would be one of many important and valuable ways that we might teach our students to read. And then especially in writing studies or rhetorical studies, that would be a foremost mode that we want to teach. But that we might teach different modes in different disciplines or different contexts. But you seem to be pitching that's the mode, or at least the first mode across the curriculum. So I'm interested if you might talk some about why that mode, instead of maybe just teaching or encouraging faculty to teach all the modes.
Okay, well, I actually don't see rhetorical reading as I define it in the book, using Hassenflower and also Alice Horning. I don't actually see it as a mode of reading so much as
Okay.
just a habit of reading with a lot of self-awareness and a lot of openness to the occasion for the writing of the text. So that, I mean, even if you take the most, let's say apparently objective kind of text, a scientific report, let's say, students need to be able to locate that, as we say, in a conversation of ongoing thinking and research.
Yeah.
That's part of what I'm talking about here. Not reading the text in isolation as a sui generis document, but as as part of that. I guess you could use the Burkean, conversation in the parlor metaphor, or what have you. It's obviously not a new idea. I don't think the need to help students see writing in that way is necessarily as purposefully taught in classrooms across the curriculum as maybe it could be. And I think it would be helpful if students got that kind of instruction, not just in composition classes or English classes, but in every class, as my chapter on the faculty development community, I think, tries to illustrate.
One particular skill that you kind of repeatedly stress at multiple points in the book that I hadn't really thought of much before, and so your returning to it, I think was helpful, was this skill of connecting the parts to the whole. That when we're teaching students how to read, that in particular is a essential skill. So I teach annotation and asking questions, and like you said, it's really valuable to help students see the text as part of a conversation, but then also this specific move of, okay, what does this sentence have to do with the paragraph, this paragraph have to do with the section. So tell me how you came across seeing that as a particular need and particular opportunity to help students read better.
Well, I guess again, I'm drawing on the work of other scholars. I mean, I think overall this book doesn't really say anything particularly new in itself, but it brings together a lot of ideas that have been floating around in different places. And I'm hoping it's helpful and useful for that reason, maybe among a few others. But yeah, I'm drawing on work done, for example, by John Bean, who in his chapter on engaging ideas, talks about helping students, read critically, and mentions this exercise where students do what he calls a says-does analysis, so that as you're reading perhaps an essay, you will not only be trying to understand what it is the author is saying in that particular part of the essay, but also what role rhetorically that part of the essay plays in the whole. So, is it a generalization? Is it an example? Is it a counter argument? Is it a qualification of the argument? I mean, I came to this idea that we need to focus more on that aspect of helping students read as we are helping them write better. Many, many years ago in a composition class, where I realized, I'm teaching an essay and students are not necessarily clear about where the author is making a sort of broad claim or broad assertion, and where there's an argument or illustration or detail that's meant to support that. And it's sort of, everything is, in that context, many students were reading everything kind of at the same level, of rhetorical import or significance. And that, of course, diminishes comprehension. And then another example, and I think all of us who've taught comp or lit have had this experience where students will take the author's summary of what other people have said about this subject for the author's own argument. And that's, of course, where the they say, I say that Graff and Birkenstein have written about, where that comes in. In fact, kind of semi-comically, I guess. I noticed this in the public in current events recently. We are at this point, as we speak, just coming off the trial, the second impeachment trial. I'm not intending to get political here, but what the point I'm making is relevant to our conversation about part to whole. So evidently the defense team for the former president brought to bear an article by a legal scholar, a law professor, who they said, the defense attorney said, had supported their point that the whole process had real constitutional problems associated with it and therefore shouldn't even be proceeding. And the professor had to come forward to say, no, that's not what I actually said in my article. I was summarizing all different positions and different ways of looking at this, as a good lawyer might. And then really, I ultimately came down, saying that I thought on balance, the arguments in favor of proceeding on legal grounds were actually stronger. And so I don't know whether the lawyers who were using this article to make their case, didn't read it carefully or were being cynical and misrepresenting it. I have no way of knowing. Right. But I just thought there's an example of how easy it is really to take a piece of an argument or any work really out of context and have it do the work you want it to do while misrepresenting what role it plays in the piece as a whole. So that's really important.
Yeah. I really like that example, how, you've just masterfully woven a specific reading move to this grand political context. And I've noticed before when I'm reading, sometimes I will be reading an author describing a situation or a position, and they haven't said what they think about it yet, but I am just waiting for them to critique it, because and so I pause and what told me that they were gonna? Was it the specific tone? Was it just the place in the genre, right? And then I thought, well, students might not even know that they're not saying that, they're not endorsing this view, but also what were the cues that clued me in that I could help students pay attention to? And I suspected that some of the really subtle ones, you just the way we learn body language, so we notice somebody tensing up, we might not be able to say where on their face we noticed it. It was just a lifetime of experience. So I wonder if some of that's going on as well.
Oh, totally. I think absolutely is. And that's what makes our job, one of the things that makes our job really hard, is that many of the things that we either take for granted or want to teach, we don't have a specific conscious recollection of having been taught or having learned in a conscious way. And so I think it's really difficult to then sort of backward design that. How did we come to know what we know? The kinds of things you just mentioned, I think, are great examples, Paul, of the sort of automatic mental moves you make when you read an essay and you're sensing, okay, this is the they say part, or I'm being set up to hear a counter argument. What is it? What are the clues and cues that alert us to that? And so, so I do think because we're not necessarily in possession of a sort of algorithm or any kind of recipe, for teaching that, we have to really think long and hard about the best ways to help students acquire those skills if they haven't done that by the time they get to our classes. And I think that's a huge part of our job, and it would make a difference if professors in classes across the curriculum were to focus on that. And it can be done really without sacrificing what we like to think of as the content of our classes. When you're teaching comp, you're thinking, well, it is a skills class, in some basic way. And so you don't have to quote cover, you know, chapters 1 to 10 necessarily in a textbook the way another professor might feel obliged to do. So professors across the curriculum might say, well, this isn't my job, you know, I'm here to teach what they, you know, what I regard as content. But really, I'm arguing that the content and the skills are really inseparable. And to the degree that you focus on helping students understand how to read the content, you're going to get a much deeper comprehension of it. And so the payoff for everyone will be much greater.
Right. The fact that you have covered something is independent from whether students have learned it.
We all know that.
Right.
That's the sad truth at the core of teaching, yes.
I want to think that that most faculty, most professors don't want to just give students information. They want to teach the discipline that they're part of. The work of and I mean, that's what a discipline is. It's mostly the work, and then it's the work on the content, maybe, but it's, like you said, inseparable. And I think your comment kind of anticipates my next question. Is in any discipline in higher education, reading is part of the work. We're a literate subculture. Meaning we do our work through language. Even mathematicians and engineers who work in numbers and physical materials communicate constantly through language, and this is just how we do. This is how we do all of these disciplines, and so I think, like, kind of framing that for faculty and for students, that when you are reading, you're not just getting content, you are doing the work of the discipline. And I thought that you framed that in a really useful way by talking about epistemologies and disciplinary epistemologies. So that mathematician reads in a different way than the historian, than the engineer, than the poetry professor, because we all believe, or we all are doing the work of the discipline, or the work of creating and debating knowledge in that discipline, and what knowledge is in that discipline is different, but all connected to reading. So I wonder if you might talk more about kind of that frame of reading in relation to disciplinary epistemologies.
Sure. You may know, for many years I directed a faculty development group at my university with the acronym BRIDGE, and that stood for Bridging Research, Instruction, and Discipline-Grounded Epistemology. So a big mouthful, but I really wanted the participants to focus on what it was, what you just said, Paul, what it was about their particular discipline that made it maybe different from others. What kind of work do we do in this discipline? What counts as a good question, and how do we then try to find answers to that question? And what kinds of arguments do we use to share what we discover through our research? And what are the assumptions of our likely audience members, etc. What can we assume our readers already know? What can we assume they need to be better informed about? These are not easily answerable questions, and to many students, they are entirely mysterious, which is perfectly understandable. And so what happened in that faculty development group, which was really not focused purposefully on reading, but rather on having professors define a teaching issue that they were having. You could call it a problem, you could call it a challenge, whatever term you want to use, but something they were grappling with, and try to figure out what it was they could do differently, the professors could do, instead of just saying the students are just not getting this, or they don't know how to do fill in the blank. Okay, well, what can we do as professors to provide that scaffolding, to support them, and to help them see what it means to do this kind of work? And so it turned out that many, I won't say most, but many of the projects that were derived from that development did ultimately come down to reading. The students were not really reading the texts that were assigned with the kinds of critical understanding that professors had been taking for granted. And when they shifted their strategies to design assignments to support the reading much more explicitly, I would say invariably they got better results. So now those strategies are going to be different, perhaps. There are some generic analogies, of course, similarities across disciplines, but you might shape your approach differently depending on the discipline that you're involved in. And that was my point in having that chapter on the bridge projects, was to illustrate how that works across the disciplines and the ways in which not only professors in different disciplines, but at different levels of the discipline might shape their assignments, perhaps in an intro class, to initiate their students into the skills required for understanding this kind of work. And then at a higher level, I gave an example of a higher level biochem course where the professor expected students to not just read with understanding, but critique the way the authors of the articles had been using quantitative data to make their point, and whether the verbal explanations of the data seemed accurate or sufficient. So I mean, that's a very high level, of course, where you're getting students to actually not just digest information, but assess its presentation and validity. So you're going to expect different things, obviously, at different levels, but certainly teaching the epistemology of a discipline is part of our job, and again, something that we may not have paid a whole lot of attention to in I don't know, in past decades. I've been in this university setting for quite a few decades now. So, what seems recent to me may not seem, may seem like, oh yeah, we've been doing that for a long time, right? To people somewhat younger. But as they say, I'm old enough to remember when, professors said nothing about, the nature of their discipline or why it was important or why we asked these kinds of questions. And so one other related point I'll just mention, if I might, is as you know by now, I'm really interested in the possibilities for faculty development, which I think is so helpful to students and also a lot of fun for faculty, or can be, to share what we know, share our intellectual resources with each other, and can be a very sort of enriching experience. But one of the faculty development projects I undertook was a very, I called it kind of a mini one, because Bridge was fairly extensive and lasted over each cohort worked over the course of an academic year. But for those who might not have the opportunity to invest that kind of time in a given moment, I did a 3-day intensive workshop for faculty who frequently teach freshmen. We would call them first-year students now, I suppose. That'd be more politically correct. But the idea was to focus on initiating students new to college into some of these ideas that we've been talking about. And one of the things I had the faculty do was to make a list. I have an example here, a list that I made, and then one from another, from a chemistry professor, of what are the assumptions in my discipline? What do we take for granted is true? What are the misconceptions that first-year students typically bring to the discipline? What are the accepted methodologies for pursuing knowledge, etc.? And make a list. And we kind of compared them, and I think it was an interesting and entertaining exercise. And it brings professors out of their own sort of silos, right? We always say professors are too much in their own silos and their own departments and disciplines, and this gives you an opportunity to see what students are being asked to do and how they're being asked to think as they move from class to class to class. So it gives you a much better perspective on the student experience across the board.
I think that, I really appreciate how you point out that reading connects to all of these other problems. And I think that's similar to in the writing across the curriculum movement, especially in a book like you just mentioned, John Bean's Engaging Ideas, right? That he's talking about writing, but really he's talking about, here is how you get students to learn deeply, and writing can connect to almost any kind of deeper learning. But it seems to me that reading then is even more fundamental. So we might have however many writing assignments and however many courses, and writing might have whatever place in all of our disciplines, but the reading occupies even more space and happens even sooner. And so I really like this idea of teaching reading and rethinking reading as not a side project, but is as very close to the heart of all of the things that we want to.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, Paul, that when we talk about the importance of reading, um, I think about an essay written for a non-specialist audience that I came across in doing the research for this book. But you find similar arguments for more highly specialized audiences. This article's title was "Reading Can Make You Smarter." It sounds a little goofy, but I think it embeds a serious point, namely that it's not just how you read, but what you read. And I'm going to guess that most of what I've said so far would not generate much controversy in our field. I think most people would find, most of what I said fairly acceptable. But what I'm going to say next might be a little more controversial. I don't know. Namely that we might consider, when we choose readings for a course for first-year students and others, considering the intellectual, what I call the intellectual capital, the cultural, part of the cultural capital of a society, and what it is that we take for granted we know. When we hear allusions, in popular culture, or when we read or watch some kind of performance or whatever it might be, and you hear allusions to figures and texts that we assume, I think we have been assuming, most educated people, would at least, be somewhat familiar with. If you have a choice of anything to teach your students, I say, why not use at least part of your time to help them become familiar with some of these touchstone texts. Now, I know, it brings up the elitism that was the elitist accusations that were the backlash to E.D. Hirsch's cultural literacy, and I do talk a bit about that in the book, and sort of suggestions for updating Hirsch's basic idea without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I would advocate, and as I say in the book, I do advocate strenuously for helping students grapple with some of these enduring texts, even as we try to engage them in ideas and events that seem, quote, more relevant. My argument is that these texts endure because they're always relevant, and not necessarily to present them as exemplars of ideas that we should embrace, certainly open them to critique, but at least have students be conversant with them in ways that I think would serve them well as they go forward.
Well, I am coming back around to this idea, having resisted it for many years, this idea of stressing the importance of background knowledge, essentially, is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think you cite the psychologist Willingham.
Yes, Daniel Willingham. Yeah.
And I remember reading years ago, he in one of his books, he gives this very simple paragraph, all like almost monosyllabic words, clear, plain sentences. And the idea is you have no idea what he's talking about until you have the background knowledge that he's talking about sorting your laundry before putting in the machine. And then all of the sentences make sense. And he gives that as an illustration that, whenever we're reading a text, we're bringing all sorts of stuff that's background knowledge that's essential. So I knew that for a long time, but still I resisted it because not just the kind of elitist ideas that certain background knowledge is canonical. And I appreciate, well taken that we could say, okay, well, different knowledge is then. But also just it seemed to play into the whole teaching as coverage, right? If students need background knowledge, then let's cover as much as we can. And so I really, for a lot of years, just kind of resisted, like there's too much background knowledge, we can't cover it, so it's not really very valuable. But just a couple days ago, I recorded myself a Think Aloud reading protocol. So I screencasted and used my tablet so it would record my annotations live, and I spoke out loud what I was thinking while I was reading to create a resource for my students. And I read an entire essay by Scholes, the Transition to College Reading, which is 7 pages long, and it took 2 hours. So this is not a resource the students are going to use. They're going to have to figure out what to do with it, maybe edit it. But
that was a great exercise, Paul. I love that. It was
was
so illuminating for you too, to see that.
exactly, and this is what it illuminated, is I found that constantly what I was explaining and talking aloud about was how I knew what he was talking about outside of the text,
Exactly.
and how this fit in with what other people said, and how so much that I knew that I brought to that text, students would have no idea, no way of knowing, because you wouldn't know unless you had been studying this niche disciplinary focus. So he cites you in that essay, and I'm like, oh, I read that essay. I read the essay he cites, and I'm going to talk to her in a few days. And my students who are they going to read the same essay wouldn't possibly know that. And so I guess what that highlighted for me is not an answer, but if I don't pay attention to how the role of background knowledge, I'm kind of doing exactly what I don't want to do, which is kind of hiding the keys. It's kind of doing an illusion, right? I teach students, I'm not showing students what it is that I'm doing when I'm reading, and what it is that they can do.
And I would say the knowledge is not just, as you were saying before, not just information, but also understanding how to read. So it's also, habits of mind, which is what we need to keep working on and keep cultivating. I think that's a great example of how much we take for granted when we assign a reading. And as you point, Willingham, I think, has done some great work. He's one of those psychologists, and also people working in literary theory and pedagogy, who make the point that it takes knowledge. It takes knowledge to learn. It's if you look up something in a vacuum, and you're just sort of pointing this out with your story about your own exercise there. If you look up something in a vacuum, you have nothing to connect it to. It's really hard to digest it and process it and put it in a place where it makes sense as part of a larger narrative or web of connections. And so if you're starting, from some place where you're not really sure, what the assumptions are here or what's expected, it's going to be really hard to then get as much as you might do out of that reading. So here's one of the most interesting studies I read, talks about how, kids who, just going back to just learning how to read literally when you're a little kid, kids who crack that code that, symbols on the page represent sounds, and then you can make meaning from those sounds. Kids who do that fairly early learn to read. And then they start to read, and because they can read, it's kind of fun. It's fun to do something that you know how to do that isn't a big struggle.
Right.
And so they tend to read more. And so because they read more, they tend to acquire more knowledge. And then that knowledge becomes, the fulcrum for acquiring even more knowledge. And so there's a kind of geometric progression. So the kids who might struggle and not have their difficulties addressed early are going to be disadvantaged over time. And it's really an imperative, it's a moral imperative we have to help students early on, crack that code, so to speak, and give them the support they need, because there is this snowball effect, which produces greater inequities over time. I think I mentioned in the book, it's called the Matthew effect.
Right.
Which is not meant to be a religious term in this context, but taken from the biblical text, that basically to reduce the beautiful King James prose to something more pedestrian, just the rich will get richer and the poor poorer, basically, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to happen. We do want the rich to get richer, but we want the poor to get richer, in equal or even greater measure, to close some of these gaps.
Right.
And so it's really incumbent upon us to acknowledge this issue, I think, and to understand that, as you were saying, background knowledge, plays a critical role in success, and so again, I think these are issues we can purposefully, address in our curriculum.
I think my next question is related to some of the things that we're talking about. And so there's the immediate shift that we are advocating, you are advocating, of moving from understanding what that professors and then teacher students shift our understanding of what reading is, from A, taking in information, to B, undertaking some of the intellectual work of the discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So that shift in understanding reading, it seems to me, is mirrors and part of, and only makes sense in light of, and then instantly makes sense as part of this larger shift in understanding what learning is. Shifting from A, acquiring information, to B, developing the skills and dispositions of a discipline. And you mentioned that you've been around long enough so that something that seems recent to you might not to other people. And I'm wondering though, if this particular shift in what it is we're doing, if every generation of teachers has to make the shift themselves.
It's a great question, Paul. As I think about it, I would say the short answer is yes. I think you're right about that. But there's also a kind of frustration for me here because as you may know, and I think some of your other, Sherry Lincoln, for example, another one of your interviewees, also had this experience as a Carnegie Fellow. The Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, we both participated in that, and that was a real turning point for me because it did bring these issues to the fore in ways that I had been inchoate before. I did sort of rumbling around, and the experts from the Carnegie Academy helped, and also my colleagues, that we worked with in seminars. That was actually the model for Bridge that I then took to Rider, or developed at Rider. But it occurred to me that a lot of what we were saying wasn't exactly new necessarily. Maybe the need to address it felt urgent, but again, maybe that's because it was, urgent for us in that moment. But I feel as though there's so much good work. There was then, and there's even more now out there about these issues, but that we don't necessarily develop and subscribe to a body of research that converges on these findings in ways that then penetrate the curriculum. I think, as a discipline, we tend to, and properly so, and I celebrate this as well, we value our, individual interests, idiosyncrasies, academic freedom to do what we want, pursue interests in the way that we want. We don't, unlike some other disciplines, sort of have standard things we think we need to cover in semester 1 and semester 2, right? It's not as much, I guess, what we do is not as much of what you might call a building block discipline. I have colleagues in the sciences or, in business college, like, well, they have to know ABC before they can take this course. It's a prereq. We don't have as much emphasis on prereqs, I think, typically in English departments. So there are different epistemological issues there. At the same time, I think we may have not adequately, as a discipline, address the importance of collecting and respecting the bodies of knowledge that do seem to converge on, things that we know, or know, as well as you can know anything before it's disproved, right? But things that seem to have, compelling weight, and so I'd like to see. Again, I'm not the only person saying this, but I don't think it has gotten enough attention. Maybe more attention to some of these truisms, if you want to say that, that we know are there, but we kind of, when we design our courses, maybe don't pay as much attention to them. I mean, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to foster habits of mind and to unpack for a kind of conscious pedagogy what we seem to think we do unconsciously. It's really hard, but I do think it's incumbent upon us to undertake that.
I I agree. Uh, I I'm thinking about, I just in my the current first year writing and research, I guess it's actually a second year course in the curriculum at my school, um, to teach them how to do a research project. We all did one together as a group, and I said I'm picking the topic because somebody's got to pick, and I'm the teacher. And I love reading, so we're going to research reading. And so what we ended up doing is we designed, the research question was, what do the students in this class feel about reading? And so we created a survey and they all took it. And we analyzed the results. And one of the things that we found was out of only one student in the class said this didn't apply to them, which is that they lost the joy of reading. The school, when they were a teenager, took the joy of reading from them. And so I'm thinking of a parallel, right? That's really sad. So if students approach reading with some kind of drudgery or joylessness, and if teachers think, oh, that's a study skill, their English teachers need to teach them that, their middle school English teachers need to teach them that, it's not my job. That we're really, both teachers and students are missing an opportunity that to be able to pick up a text and actually engage with it as an intellectual being, to make meaning out of it with it, is a joyful activity that I think teachers could get passionate about and students could get passionate about. And so I'm really hoping that this work we can just continue across the disciplines to really, I guess, spark a love of reading. That seems maybe a simple, simplistic even way of framing all of this. But we've got the goods, and I think they're compelling goods that students and teachers, once they get it, would love it.
Well, you've raised a lot of issues here, and lots of things are racing through my mind. One is that the whole notion of doing a research project means so many different things to different people. What that's all about, what research means for first year students, what the final product should look like. And we could have a whole conversation all about that. Again, I do address that in the book, and I'm kind of agreeing with Kathleen Yancey and some others that we need to rethink that whole notion of the first year research project. But
Right.
I'd like to just focus for a minute on another aspect of what you said, and about the importance of helping students find joy in reading. And again, I'm going to argue something that I think might sound counterintuitive to many people, and that is I like to have students engage with texts that at first seem totally unrelated to them. That I like to say, I want students to alienate themselves from themselves for a time, and then come back. Having been in a way someone other than themselves, or having tried to be, and then come back and say, well, what's different about the me that I now am? How do I think differently, having inhabited someone else's position? And so the text, and I know that there are very good arguments for the kinds of things you've just described, which is to have students focus on, their feelings, about reading, or whatever else might feel directly connected to them. I kind of do the opposite in a way, and I say, no, we're going to read stuff that you might at first say, why do I care about this? And again, this is where some of these enduring texts come in. What I have found is that, first of all, students are sort of flattered that you're giving them texts that, maybe they've heard these names, the names of these quote unquote great writers, and they associate that with college, and now they're reading that stuff. So I think it's got a psychological effect, but once you've helped them digest that material and see why it still resonates, I think it gives them something of their own that carries forward. And again, it goes to this question of needing background knowledge and cultural capital, intellectual capital, and being versatile and flexible across different you know, ways of thinking, writing, and seeing. This is not to say these are the only kinds of texts they should read, but certainly starting them off, you know, with texts that are challenging and are cultural touchstones. I mean, sometimes I've done a sequence, you know, that entails, you know, Declaration of Independence, and then, of course, we read, you know, Stanton and Mott and the Seneca Falls Declaration, and we read Frederick Douglass. And I mean, and these are, you know, not easy things to parse. Okay, they're written in, you know, quote, old-fashioned language. We read Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, which of course is commonly taught. But there's so much in there that is. No, not just historical, but it's in the present. You know, when is it okay to disobey laws, and how do you justify that? You know, students, I find, respond really well to these kinds of texts. And I think I mentioned in the book at one point, I had them, that we had a common reading. We do have a common reading each year for the campus. That year it was Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And I had them, we focused on a chapter from that book, and I had them impersonate Brian Stevenson and write to Martin Luther King, telling him, you know, what the status of Martin Luther King's hopes and dreams were now, you know, in the current time. And some of them just really did a lovely job with that challenge. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not ignoring, you know, current and quote relevant. I say quote, I put it in quotes because I think relevance sometimes is too narrowly construed.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly don't you know, eschew relevance, but I also think we need to expand the notion of what that means, and again, give them that really, you know, those wonderful texts that endure and that make arguments that still need to be addressed today. Those arguments are not dead arguments, right? They're still living.
Right. Like I can definitely see how the way I framed that question opened up lots of things that we could talk about for a long time. But I guess what I'm, even though that assignment is not an assignment that you do, I think I'm fundamentally agreeing with you in that what my assignment did is it documented that my students lost the joy of reading. And what you're talking about, right, to take, you and I know this, and I think all professors know this, that if you can take a difficult text in your discipline and make meaning out of it, right? If you can take Frederick Douglass's incredible sentences and parse them and put them in conversation with something written, you know, all these years later, and like make that connection and make meaning, that is joyful. If you can take the Declaration of Independence and understand something you hadn't seen before. And so I think what I'm saying is that, or what we're agreeing on is that the very act of reading, of making meaning out of complexity, is something that students and professors alike can find joy in.
Absolutely. And you know, the great thing when you teach King's letter, and there's so much allusion in there, and if students have read some of those prior texts, you know, they're like, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. I read the Declaration. We read the Gettysburg. I know what he's talking about. He's alluding to Socrates, and oh yeah, we read a little bit of Plato. And then, so I tell them, well, now you're part of the conversation because you know, you've read those things too. And so I think, you know, there's some excitement attached to that because you're now becoming part of the in club instead of standing outside it. So to understand that the writers that endure are themselves, you know, engaging the intertextual mission here, right? And then, you know, you're kind of acquiring that. You're seeing how that conversation goes on, not just in its own time, but through the centuries. I just think that it's very respectful of our students. And what I mean by that is, I think, you know, we sometimes, as I said, in the book, we sometimes underestimate them. Sometimes we overestimate them. I go do this research. I'm not saying your case is not like that, but I've seen people overestimate students' ability to go read some articles, you know, and integrate them, synthesize them. Other times I think we underestimate what they can do with guidance and with, you know, with good assignment design.
Yeah. Well, I suspect in the case of, you know, go read this article, it's just reading, we're less overestimating our students and more underestimating the task we've assigned.
Exactly. No, that's a good way of putting it, Paul. Absolutely.
Like this is go read a scholarly article in a discipline is really hard.
Exactly. No,
Like
that
how many
is
years did we train to do that?
exactly.
And then yet to then recognize that, I really like your framing. This is respectful of students' intellectual abilities. I believe with support, you can do something really hard and like it.
Yeah. I mean, this is what college is. You know, this is what college is. You know, you don't go into college thinking I'm going to have my, you know, existing feelings and beliefs ratified. You're like, I'm going to have them shaken up, and you know, it's going to be fun. And I, you know, I always tell my students, if we discuss something controversial, which we generally do, I said, look, you know, we're not unpacking this so that you become a believer. Okay, you may find this idea hateful, you know, or
Mm.
you know, repugnant. It's up to you to make that judgment. But what we want here is for all of us to understand what the argument is. And think about it over time. Put it into conversation with other arguments. You know, keep it there as part of your you know, your cultural library. And your ideas will change over time, or maybe not. But at least if you stay where you are now, you'll have the you know, the intellectual ability to explain why. Right? It won't just be
Yeah.
an opinion.
Well, and even something as simple as that. I remember I was putting together my reading lists for my doctoral comps, and one of the areas was literary pedagogy, and I was talking with my doctoral advisor for that area about what texts include and what to exclude, and I essentially said, well, let's not include this text because that writer is wrong about reading. Um, and she said, well, like you still want to know that they said that's a position. And then that kind of clicked for me. Like I wasn't trying to figure out the truth about reading. I was trying to know what the conversation was. And that took me however far into my doctoral studies to get. So that's pretty advanced, or I'm was slow. But
No,
even things like
no,
that.
I think you were very enthusiastic about doing things the way you thought they should be done, you know, and that's not a bad quality, Paul. That's okay. But your mentor also had a point there. Yeah, you do kind of want to sort of acknowledge all aspects of the conversation, even the ones you find totally off base, right?
Well, that was so helpful for me and still does. And that's exactly what you're talking about with students is let's understand that these are the ideas. And then you can decide what you think.
Yeah, and you know, I also think, you know, it's an art to decide when and how to let your own position be known, and so I'm always sort of doing that little balancing act. I usually, if I do express it, I put caveats all around it. I'm saying, well, you know, here's what I've come to understand or think about this over time, and here's why. But you know, other people will argue this, you know. So I honestly don't want them to think they have to parrot, you know, the party line. And generally, I think I've been reasonably successful. I kind of, I don't know, I kind of don't like the notion of pretending that I'm just sort of, you know, objective filter and I haven't thought about these things myself. So, so I think that is, you know, that again is a balancing act that has to be sort of renegotiated in, you know, maybe in every context that you're in. You know, you
Mm.
decide what would be okay to say about your own position, you know, in any particular classroom or level or whatever it might be. But I'm always conscious of that as well, because I've been called quite opinionated. I used to love that. She's very opinionated. Well, yeah, I have positions, you know, that I've thought about. I think that's different from just simply having an uninformed opinion, you know. And I think it's another good lesson for students to understand the difference between an opinion and an informed position or
Right.
argument based on something you've really thought through, considering, as you were saying, the different points of view. So, so I think that's another, you know, that's another kind of quality of maturation that we help students undertake. Yeah. The other thing, we haven't, I don't know, we haven't talked about this at all, but, in the beginning of my book, I do address the some of the challenges of going ahead with the Common Core state standards, which I know are not as mandatory as they were initially, but are still being kind of used as guidelines, I think, pretty widely. And and I found it really interesting to go back and look at the sample lessons that were posted, I guess it's about 10 years ago now, on the Gettysburg Address, for example, or, on Letter from Birmingham Jail, and to see what the ideas were about how to teach those things. And a big, as you probably know, the notion that students were to stay within the four corners of the text elicited, and understandably, a huge backlash. And there were all kinds of accusations of a kind of, reversal and a regression, I guess is the better word, regression to what were considered, new critical constraints that were intolerable and elitist, etc. And so I undertook to try to understand, first of all, where the Common Core assumptions were coming from, and I think that became pretty clear. They were trying to, again, have students focus on what a text means instead of talking all around it or using it as what has been called a springboard to just, what do you think about, freedom or whatever it is? Like, what is this text saying? What is this guy saying, or this person saying? And so in their zeal, and again, I understand it, to have students focus on parsing out the text, they kind of ignored context, it seems, completely. And that, of course, as we've just been discussing, is problematic because of the importance of background knowledge. So I think that's another balancing act we have to yes, help students engage in close reading of texts, while also reminding them and helping educate them about the context that generated those texts. So the Gettysburg Address is, an ideal thing to use for that sophisticated purpose, because it's such an iconic piece of work, such a, very short, beautifully crafted. Gary Wills, has sort of dissected its linguistic mastery. And so it's easy to make it sort of an icon without understanding, again, the competing pressures on Lincoln, and the fact that he himself struggled with, what to do about, the issue of expansion of slavery and the notion of emancipation, and these were very fraught issues for him, and so and he evolved over time. So one other point there is that the people whose works we read themselves were human beings, and they changed over time too. So any one thing you read by them, might appear to be different from something else you might read by that person. And you have to humanize the people whose ideas have become influential, and showing how they grappled. They didn't just come to these things, but they grappled, just as we all have to grapple with our positions on complex issues.
And what better way to do that than through reading texts that are complex and that are not our own view?
That's why I love using To Kill a Mockingbird as an example of this, because it is so easily, I think, looked upon as a comforting fable.
Mm.
I mean, and to me, the way I see it at this point, Harper Lee's genius resides in large measure in her ability to write a story that would operate on that level, but also, embed a pretty incisive critique of her society for those who are open to, seeing that critique and making themselves feel uncomfortable by perhaps seeing themselves as complicit in the problem. So I think that was quite an accomplishment on the part of Harper Lee. And I chose that also because that book is often read, both in high school and in college. I think it's still, I teach it in a college class, and sort of, unwrapping the layers there can be an exercise in seeing how to do this kind of meta reading of a literary text.
Well, Arlene, thank you so much for talking with me, and thank you so much for this book. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about?
I made a few notes. I'm looking them over to see if that is true. I mean, obviously, all of us who are professors could go on, but but I think I've covered the major points. I certainly appreciate your terrific questions, which enabled me to cover a lot of these points. And I'm hoping that, if people are interested in them, they'll read the book, and, I certainly welcome, you know, um, people who want to say, maybe I got something wrong there, or I went off base somewhere. The conversation has to be ongoing. So, I think, I think you did a good job, and let me say, what I wanted to say for the most part. Thanks, Paul.
Well, thank you. I think this is a really valuable book. I hope it'll be widely read, and that we'll just keep moving this conversation forward. And I think it strikes so close to the heart of what higher education is. Just wrote down. You said this is what college is. And I don't know if when you said those exact words, if you mean specifically reading or the broader concept of
Well,
including ideas of others. But
yeah, reshaping your identity as you're exposed to the ideas of others, rethinking. I mean, I would like to sort of move away from this notion of essentialism. Some of my students like talk about, well, it's who I really am, and I'm not sure that's the best way forward. When you kind of want to, yes, you do want to have a core of principles, but you also want to open yourself, obviously, to, as we say, inhabiting the positions of others and seeing what that might feel like and look like. So yeah, it's risky. It's quite risky, but certainly rewarding. And I do want to thank you, Paul, for undertaking this series of interviews, because I've listened to several of the others that you did and found them really interesting and helpful.
thank you for doing that.
So good work. Thank you.
Well, so long.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. Bye-bye.